Welcome to Module 3 of Create Your Cosmology, where we dive into the role of the body in meaning making.
Okay, welcome everyone to Create Your Cosmology Module 3. Today we're going to be talking about cosmology and body and how our body is a vehicle for us as meaning makers and creatives, and also our relationship to our body as something that we imagine and conceptualize, and the different ways we can think about our body. And before we begin, give yourself a moment to welcome yourself into the space. So, when you're ready, I want to invite you to allow your eyes to close or to soften your eyes and gaze at the floor and start to feel the world within you. Where do you feel sensation? How does it feel in your spine? How do your extremities, like your hands and feet, feel? What are they expressing to you? And as you take your next breath, imagine this breath is an invitation to all the cells in your body to come into this space with their wisdom and their expression and their unique language. Imagine the place between your shoulder blades softening. And allow your inhale to be almost like a gift or an offering to every single cell in the body. As if it's saying, as if the breath is saying, I see you, I sense you, thank you, and listening. And with each of your exhales, imagine you are giving permission to your body to let go of anything that's not necessary to hold in this time we will spend together. Not analyze, just intending to release and soften. Begin to imagine all of the energy in the mind and from everywhere in the body is settling in the center of the heart, where your actual physical heart is. And for a moment, for a few breaths, we'll just listen to that space, focusing our awareness in the heart space. Notice what is felt, sensation, or subtle messages. In our next round of breath, I want you to let your exhale be really big. set the intention that all the work we do in this time together throughout all of our interactions before the highest good of each of us here and all those that we connect to. When you're ready, I want to invite you to flutter your eyes open and come back into the space. Before we begin, I just want to remind you that some of the resources that I will send around, I will be unsurprised if they solicit a pretty big reaction within you. And for me, last week, I shared a reaction of really pretty big terror that I experienced. And as I sorted through it, I knew that reaction was not because the information didn't resonate for me, but because my body was immediately triggered into a script about, I know how this will come across to other people. And I'm so afraid about all the assumptions that will be made about me because I believe this one fact or this one thing. Now I'm going to get lumped into a whole category of 10 to 20 other beliefs that go with this one fact. And for other people, the feeling of terror or holding your breath might be, I don't actually like the this is not for me. I don't want to watch this. I don't want to read this. And that might change in the future, but it also might not. And to be very transparent, as we talked about in week one about our subjectivity, I don't desire to put forth a new objective linear lens that I want everyone to believe in, but instead to use this first 4 weeks as a dissolve of what might have felt very, very solid. So if I picture the world with like solid lines around it, this week has been like gently erasing some of what feels solid and putting a question mark where there might have felt like a dead end or something definitive before. And that's really my subjective agenda with what I've been laying out. That's just the truth of it. It's not to replace your beliefs with anything new, but to make space for something else to emerge for you. So I always want you to feel very welcome to say, this isn't for me, either from a critical lens or from a feeling place. That's very, very welcome in this space. I dropped a resource in this week all about navigating uncertainty. Now, it's totally different from the observer effect video. It feels like there needed to be some grounding and some practical tools for the feeling of not knowing where to go when we feel so much uncertainty. And so I shared an article about a book someone wrote about mental agility and how you can approach creating resiliency and grounding yourself when you feel uncertain. Just in case you didn't see that, that's there for you. So today's central question is going to be about cosmology and the body. And I really think about the body as a mystical vessel. It's doing so many things for us without us even noticing or realizing it. Now, this might not be true for every single body, but for most of us, our cells are regenerating without us consciously thinking about it. Our lungs are able to put oxygen into our blood without us thinking too much about it. And I think that when we think about the body as the only thing between us and the world, the vessel for experiencing our reality, there are so many questions that I have, like so many questions about how different bodies experience things differently, about how the way I internalize the world and how that might differ from my loved ones or people that I see on the street. And so today we're going to be really asking some questions about the body. Now, the first thing that I wanted to share is that I'm really curious about emotions because they take place in the body. Because think about how much of your life you spend processing your feelings and trying to understand your feelings and what they're telling you, and how much they impact your relationships. This to me seems like a really important question for meaning making and also for understanding what our bodies are and who we are, which is what are feelings? What are they? And so that's where I began my inquiry into the body today. I think that we can learn so many things in our minds and in our imagination, and sometimes our body has a totally different agenda than the one that we have decided for ourselves. And I think that's because the body holds information that sometimes feels a little separated from our conscious mind. And I, for one, will say, at this time, I'm going for a walk today. And then that time will come around, and my body will be like, no, you're not. And I always wonder, what is this trying to tell me? What is this resistance? What is this information? How do I make meaning of this when my conscious mind has a different agenda than my body? What does that mean? So I wanted to bring that forward in the beginning of this module. So the first thing I did, which I so often do, is looked up what the word emotion means in the dictionary. And I found a couple of interesting definitions. The first one says a natural instinctive state of mind deriving from our circumstances, mood, or relationships with others. First of all, I think that definition is really confusing. And second of all, I think that it's funny that it's called a state of mind. It's just an interesting turn of phrase because I feel like most of us don't instinctively categorize our emotions as something of the mind. They feel very different, very separate. And so that was interesting. And then I read instinctive or intuitive feeling as distinguished from reasoning or knowledge. This also I find nebulous because I sometimes think my instincts aren't emotional at all. My instincts might be to grab something that might be falling, and there might be no emotional charge behind that action for me. So that's also interesting, this carving out between instinct, emotion, and reason. And then I looked it up in the American Psychological Association, and they defined emotion as a complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavioral, and physiological elements. And then they went on to say emotions are how individuals deal with matters or situations they find personally significant. And we're not going to dwell too much on this page because the point is that we don't have great definitions for emotions as far as I'm concerned. And this seems really strange. This is kind of like how we, in the narrative of humans, mostly are taught we know everything and that science is at the pinnacle of understanding and there's nothing left to be understood, which isn't necessarily what every scientist says. I just feel like that's in the back of dominant cultures' mythology of what science is for us in this moment. But similarly, I feel like this is yet another question that's so important to what it means to be human that I feel like we gloss over. And it's interesting because we read so many books about attachment styles and memes about emotions, and many of the people here are parents, and all of us have been parented and we're children. So it's just interesting that this question doesn't really feel super addressed in the popular dominant narrative of the collective, or at least that the very first definitions I researched weren't very helpful or useful at all. I think that in and of itself is telling us a lot. So then I went on to look into the word emotions. And I think it's very, very interesting because apparently emotion was not a word in the English language until the early 17th century. And it was brought forward when someone translated a French essay of Montaigne into English in a newspaper. And in the translation, this journalist named John Florio apologized for using the word emotion because at the time it was considered uncouth or impolite. And it originally meant agitations, bodily movements, and commotions. So it was not even something we had an English word for a very long time. And the ancient Greeks and Romans had their ideas about emotions. And by the way, for a long time, what we now call emotions were referred to as passions, which I just think is very interesting. Ancient Greek and Roman Stoics were very anti passion slash anti-emotion and thought that we should use our reason to battle all feelings to avoid suffering. And we all know how impactful the Greek and Roman traditions, culture, and also military was on our history and the writing of our history. So, this thought, this singular idea of emotions being something to battle, that impacted people for millennia. And then there was this separate category of emotions, not passions, but affections that were carved out by Christian theologians to specify the feelings that were welcome. So, affections were specifically good, virtuous feelings like familial love and compassion, distinguished from evil passions like lust and rage. And finally, in the 18th century, they were lumped together under the umbrella of emotion. And it wasn't until a Scottish philosopher named Thomas Browne brought forward his ideas in the 19th century that they started thinking of emotion that was worth studying scientifically at all. When they decided that this was worthy of study, the first thing that happened was they realized they were very, very hard to define. And to this day, we are still dealing with this problem or unknown within the philosophical, the scientific, even the psychological world. And that is why when you study emotions, probably the first thing you will read in any scientific paper is how that particular scientist is deciding to define them. And like we said in module 1, just because someone's defined them doesn't necessarily mean that is a definition that will be true for all of us. So this is a big question because it sort of comes up every day. You know, we have these feelings every day. How do we relate to something we can't necessarily find a common language for? It's very interesting. So I picked up 3 theories that I thought would be useful for us today. The first is from Lisa Feldman Barrett. And Lisa is a psychologist, neuroscientist, and writer, and has been studying emotions and researching emotions for over 20 years. And Lisa has put forth an idea that's pretty popular right now, which is the idea that human facial expressions actually have absolutely no intrinsic meaning, that we make the meaning for what people's faces are telling us in our heads and create narratives that are mostly constructed based on our past experience or based on the context that we're in. So something that Dr. Feldman talks about is how when your stomach hurts and you're in a hospital, that could be interpreted very differently than when your stomach hurts and you're walking past a bakery. That it's a similar sensation actually, but it is the world around us telling us what to do with that sensation. And so while Dr. Barrett believes there are some hardwired feelings that infants experience that's very rudimentary, like calm versus agitated, comfort versus discomfort. But her research and her belief is that the hardwired feelings are not detailed enough for us to do anything with, and that our mind then fills everything in with detail so that we respond. And so what she's saying is that our emotions in so many ways about what others are feeling and even what we are feeling are guesses, are narrative constructions. And this kind of goes back to what we've been talking about this whole time around understanding the creativity of our perception and how subjective that we all are. So that's Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Next, we have Jaak Panksepp, who was an Estonian-American neuroscientist and psychobiologist. And Jaak believed that by studying hardwired emotions in animals, that we could also understand how our brains are wired. And he was very passionate in trying to find a neuroscience-based treatment for emotional suffering because he was a deeply compassionate scientist. And he found in his research that there are 7 universal basic primary emotions. Seeking, which is looking for a reward, which is associated with enthusiasm and excitement about the world. Rage, which is self-explanatory. Fear, which goes along with anxiety. Lust, which he equated with horniness. Care, which is tender, loving. Panic, which interestingly he associates with loneliness and sadness. So panic is universal, is with loneliness. And then there's a state of play, which he believes is connected to joy. And so he hypothesized that because our limbic system, the most ancient part of our brain, is so similar to animals, that if we study animals' limbic brains, that we can understand our emotional circuitry. And something that he would do was stimulate the areas of their brain and see what kind of emotional responses that the animals would have. And one thing I think is so interesting from his research is that he found that when he stimulated anger circuitry, that was the number one thing that animals would try and stop because they seem to really dislike the feeling of it so, so much. And of these emotions, he found that panic and separation are most commonly linked with depression and most often linked with small animals being separated from their mothers, very specifically. What he said that I think is so interesting is that holding baby animals and stimulating them with touch would allow them to calm, fall asleep, and literally alleviate their pain circuitry. And that the chemicals that they would receive when they were being held by their mother or someone else stimulating care was most closely related to the brain's opioids, right? So our natural painkillers that we create. And that what he said is that these feelings of love and attachment are partially addictive because our internal opioids are what tell us that we are secure and that everything in the world is safe and right for us. And what I think is so beautiful is that he talks about how the molecule that is manufactured in the milk of the mother is very, very effective for reducing separation distress. And he said, and this is a quote, that the physiology of motherhood is the physiology of love. And the reason I find this so interesting is because, not to get into it too much, but somehow it just comes up like we are suffering through an opioid crisis and also what seems like a crisis of disconnection. And I think it's interesting that a mother's love is what creates a feeling of soothing when, in many indigenous traditions, the earth is our mother. Like this connection to the actual earth is a maternal connection for some. And so I think it's worth really thinking about ways that our ability to create connection to the earth and other sources of connection around us can be like a painkiller for us, how connection is like a painkiller. So I wanted to share his work. He also found that human depression and sadness have the same low opioid state in the brain in humans as they do in animals like guinea pigs and chickens. And what he was trying to pioneer before he passed was being able to stimulate the brain to elevate the seeking mood, which is the mood that we're in or the state that we're in when we are learning, when we are exploring, when we're excited about what it is that we can connect to in the world. We're feeling safe enough to connect to the world when we're in that reward seeking, enthusiastic space. And that social connection is what stimulates that in us. Panksepp also said that human relationships are the best antidepressants in his research. Okay, so the third emotional theory that we're going to look at, and this is by no means exhaustive, but the third one that I picked to talk about was Antonio Damasio, who is a Portuguese-American neuroscientist and professor of psychology, philosophy, and neurology. Now, Antonio Damasio defines emotions and feelings differently. Basically, he sees emotions as anything that we experience that's primary, including sadness, happiness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust. he thinks of emotions, or he defines this as something that is innate, unconscious, hardwired, and easily observed in someone else. So when you think of disgust, I think that's the best example, because I feel like when someone is disgusted by something, you can easily tell by their facial expressions or responses to the thing that they are finding disgusting. Then he distinguishes emotions from feelings in that he calls feelings what we then cognitively do with the sensation of our emotions, meaning that there's a hardwired part of us that he calls our emotions, or our feelings is like what we construct so we can respond to our emotions. So in that sense, he's kind of like a hybrid of Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett and Yang Paxa. He believes that emotions are both universal and constructed, and that these systems are enmeshed. What I really like about him is that he talks about emotion as a highly intelligent and adaptive response, that philosophically he believes that emotions are actually part of our reasoning and decision making, which is very interesting, right? And that he brings up that emotions are part of how we regulate our systems, and that they're a very effective way for us to bioregulate ourselves and create a state of balance within our nervous system and within our cells. And also, he brings up that emotions are critical to learning and memory, which I think gets overlooked, because I feel like we're so often trying to kind of analyze our emotions away, instead of understanding that perhaps they are designed to help us come into a state of decision making, memory, and learning. But it is actually our cultural resistance to emotions and judgment of emotions that prohibits or stops that very natural process. So those are the three that I brought forward today. And we're not going to get into this too much, but there's also this other aspect about emotions. They're culturally contingent, that people in different cultures have different words for emotion, and they may mean something different to people who are in different cultural contexts. So not only are the theories that are out there very nebulous and conflicted, which is just kind of the theme of what we're learning just all around, but there's also this added layer of cultural context for emotions. So next thing I want to talk about is the nervous system. And it's something that I've just been thinking about over the last probably 6 or 7 years. It just keeps coming up to me. The nervous system, I think it's very, very much something in the collective that we're all really starting to pay attention to, because the nervous system, it does a lot. And so the nervous system is the major controlling, regulatory, and communicating system in the body. It is the center of all mental activity, including thought, learning, and memory. And together with the endocrine system, it's responsible for regulating a state of homeostasis, which is just a state of balance in the body. Through its receptors, the nervous system keeps us in touch with our environment. And I love this sentence, both internal and external. So the environment it's reading is inside and outside. And I feel like sometimes we forget about that. Like other systems in the body, the nervous system is composed of organs, the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, ganglia, and those then consist of nerves, blood, connective tissue, and this is the apparatus that carries out the complicated activities of the nervous systems. And the nervous system is responsible for sensory, integrative, and motor skills. So when we're talking about sensory input, we kind of got into this in the first module. We're talking about sensory input. Millions of sensory receptors in our bodies detect changes that are called stimulus, and these occur inside and outside. They monitor in real time temperature, light, sound from the external environment, and internally, the internal environment detects variations in pressure, pH, carbon dioxide concentration, and all levels of electrolyte. That's what our body's doing, generally speaking, even when we are not asking it to do anything, which I think is incredible. And then we come to this middle circle here where sensory input is converted into electrical signals, which are called nerve impulses that are transmitted to our brain. And that those are brought together to create sensations, produce thoughts, or add to memory. And that's the part that's called integration. So I just want to pause for a second because this will make sense a little later, but I think it's really fascinating that our bodies are electrical and that these things move through our minds as the electrical impulses and that we know what to do with them and how quickly this happens. And then we get to this third slide here, based on the sensory input, the nervous system responds by sending signals to the muscles, which tells them what to do, to contract, or to our glands, which have them produce different hormones or secretions. And the muscles and glands are called effectors because they cause an effect in response to the directions of the nervous system. Now, I wanted to share that primarily just because of what I'm going to share next, so we know what we're talking about with the nervous system. It feels like the awareness system of our body like spread out all over the whole thing, the way they describe it, because it includes the input, the internal, the external. It includes the interpretation, and then it includes the response. So like at what point do we interpret? Like when is it raw stimulus and when are we interpreting? And I think that was a hard question because in real time, we're constantly interpreting. If we weren't, we couldn't walk or breathe or, do complicated things with our body. Think of how many muscles have to work just for you to move from sitting to standing position? So there is a lot of interpretation that happens very unconsciously in real time. And so what I find really beautiful, or the reason that I brought this up, is so we could talk about co-regulation. So in polyvagal theory, which is a theory that originated with Dr. Stephen Porges, there's this idea that co-regulation is at the heart of all human relationships, and that we learn to regulate our nervous systems from each other because an infant is not born with an innate ability to regulate their nervous system. They have to receive their tonality from someone outside of them, and this begins in the womb. And so nervous systems are designed to connect and interact. And it is the tone or the coherence of one's nervous system that impacts or teaches an infant how to create homeostasis in their body. This occurs when a parent is humming in a tone that sounds like babble to a baby, when a child falls down and looks back at you to see what their response should be because they feel shocked, but they're not sure what to make of it yet. All of those interactions create pathways that allow one to learn how to regulate their nervous system. And there's this beautiful idea that it's not just the absence of danger that our nervous systems need, but they actively need connection to nourish them. And that as humans, we are designed to seek interpersonal connection, that it is biologically baked into our evolutionary needs as a species. And so, there's just this interesting thing in understanding that self regulation finds its roots in co regulation. And it's interesting because I'm so adamant about each of us having our own unique perspectives and not abandoning our interiors in order to prize the relationships or communities outside of us in such a way that we abandon ourselves. And not because that was my personal narrative and experience. That was the way the pendulum swung for me, but that might not be true for everyone. And I think that we're living in a time when nuance and complexity is really, really important. because while I believe it is so important for us to each be sovereign, we are very much designed, like according to most of what I've ever asked a question about, to interact and connect and to need and interdepend on each other in so many ways. And learning how to hold both the validity of your authentic experience and your desire to connect, I mean, that's like the primary question of human existence in so many ways. Being able to do the two and want the two at once and learning how to not get frozen in one state or the other, where one is overtaken or dominating the other, the need for connection to self and the need for connection to the other. And so I think it's really beautiful to just think about the idea that the nervous system is like this beautiful orchestra that doesn't quite know how to play itself until someone else creates a rhythm or a beat for it to go onto or hook onto. And this is something that is kind of carrying forward from what we just read about with Dr. Panksepp's work about connection being so incredibly important for us. And what scientists are pioneering at this time is that while our connection can teach us how to go into a state of homeostasis, a lack of connection in early childhood can also give our nervous systems a sort of state of mistuning, which makes us believe that our environment contains threats that actually aren't there and can really make it difficult for us to trust not only our external connections, but our internal connections and our internal reads on situations. And I think it's important to say that the most beautiful work is being done to teach us how to rewire this, that to teach us how that we are not lost in the story of our very early childhood, what we received or didn't receive in the past, but that we continue to nourish and tone these pathways every single day we have the opportunity to tune our nervous system. But first, we have to know that's something that we need or that we want in order to give that to ourselves. So I highly encourage myself and everyone here to think about what connects us to ourselves and what are the things we do with others that feel like deeply connective, that put us in that state of homeostasis or balance. The first thing we're going to get into is this concept of the body as a record keeper. So I feel like what we just talked about was the mystery of emotions and also the body as inherently the place where we connect to ourselves and others. But now we're going to talk about the work of Dr. Peter Levine. I want to say that it's important for all of us to take care of ourselves during this part of this conversation because it's just heavy. But I will never forget when I learned about Peter Levine's work. Peter Levine is a psychologist who founded something called somatic experiencing. He spent 45 years studying and treating stress and trauma and is primarily interested in biophysics. And in the 60s or 70s, he was studying the mind body connection at a time when that field was being pioneered and wasn't very substantially in existence yet. And one of the things that he was really interested in was in the ways animals react in situations where they are traumatized. Dr. Levine would watch videos of animals who had very challenging things happen to them. And something that he noticed, for example, in a video where a polar bear was being caught by researchers, was that they seemed to convulse or shake after something tremendously overwhelming happened. And he was watching a tape of this with the polar bear and he slowed it down very, very, very slow and realized that it was not a random convulsing at all that was happening, but instead that the polar bear was moving as if it was completing his ability to run away from those researchers successfully. And so what is now known is that when animals suffer some kind of overwhelming experience, like this polar bear did, is that they seek to complete their physiological fight or flight, in some cases, fawn response, which is allowing them to take back this frozen energy in their body that didn't get to complete that highly charged response and pull themselves back into the present. And what I love about Dr. Levine's work is he talks about how similar this is to the idea of shamanic soul retrieval. And as we've been talking about the plasticity of time, I have for a very long time conceptualized the ability to complete our nervous system responses as calling our energy back from a particular timeline where we may have left some of our energy. And that when we allow ourselves to complete this, we receive that resource back into the present. But that because, and I can't speak for everyone, but my experience has been a lot of, let's say, resistance to my emotional processes as a small child. That because I have a lot of incomplete moments of my emotions really working themselves out naturally in my past, that even just approaching this subject can feel like we have an iceberg of frozen experiences that were a little bit scary to sort of approach to begin with. And so I say this with a lot of pacing and slowness and bio individuality encouraged. But I think it's just so beautiful to think about the fact that perhaps we are already designed to know exactly how to process overwhelming situations, but that it is our cultural environment that has prevented us from accessing these natural resources. Now, one thing I think that's important is talking about the definition of trauma that Dr. Levine uses. And what he talks about is how people, especially children, can be overwhelmed by what many of us think of as common events, and also that we are unique. What proves harmful to one person may actually be really exciting and exhilarating to another. He then goes on to say trauma does not have to stem from a major catastrophe. We may become traumatized, and I think this is important, when our ability to respond to a perceived threat is in some way overwhelmed. The inability to respond can impact us in obvious ways and subtle ways. But in short, trauma is about loss of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, to our families, to others, and the world around us. And so I want to just take a pause here because I think that we talk about the word trauma in this really casual way in the popular discourse or social media. And I think it's really cool when people want to create nuance in that space. Because again, that media is just another form of media. It's really up to us how we want to create that culture in that space. Like, yes, there's the algorithm, but we are also powerful. I think just acknowledging how close trauma is to overwhelm is profound. I think for many sensitive people who also usually tend to be, in my experience, very creative, curious, and original thinkers, that overwhelm is very common because they're receiving and perceiving so much at once as very multidimensional beings, being the world from many levels of who you are all at the same time. And so it's curious to me that the culture we're in, both technologically and entertainment wise and work culture wise, is so incredibly overwhelmed by design. This is the case, in my opinion, of it's not you, it's me, and that it's me is the culture of normalized overwhelm. And so, I think that a lot of us were taught to relativize our challenges as children. I don't know if anyone else was taught when they were upset to think about others who had it worse than them. And I think there's a lot of merit to that for a lot of different people because it's important to perceive the world outside our little bubble. But maybe when you're 2 or 3 or 4, the extremely charged event that's happening within you needs more holding and connection and co-regulation than explaining away. And it is through the lines of our caregivers that we can sometimes be met with just discomfort of the bigness of who we are and how we feel, and that that is something that they may have also experienced as children. And so I think that it's really, really beautiful to be able to understand that based on the work of Dr. Peter Levine, that he sees trauma as a place that we can look to recover ourselves. And that when we recover ourselves, our energy, and complete our responses, that that is a wellspring of creativity, that is a wellspring of resource. And he specifically says creativity. I think knowledge without a doubt, but I'm really interested and excited about the idea that this thing that we are so taught to fear and sort of box in could be this beautiful, fertile place if we just had the tools and agency to complete our responses at the pace that makes sense for each of us as individuals. I had a big bathtub moment today. It was my favorite place to have ideas. And so I was sitting there and thinking about loss of connection and how so much that I read about is about loss of connection to ourselves, loss of connection to others, loss of connection to different dimensions of ourselves, to the earth. And I was thinking, wow, maybe this is why we put so much pressure on individual people, which sets them up to fail because we expect them to be a resource of something that actually the whole universe is a resource for. And so in romantic love, we have these ideas that put extreme pressure on one person. In parenting, we have these ideas that put extreme pressure on one person. And it's not to say those aren't sacred roles, but I do sometimes wonder if we felt resourced by everything within us and everything outside of us, if we could remove some of that pressure from individual people and institutions that we hyper focus on, and so that we're not perpetually disappointed in ourselves and others, if we could spread out the resources to the world around us instead of have them be monopolized in a way by the imagination of the collective, it would be much more difficult to lose connection because there would be connection everywhere we looked and everywhere we turned. So now I want to talk a little bit about epigenetics. Epigenetics is this emerging area of scientific research that shows how environmental influences and experiences actually affect the expression of our genes. They turn our genes off and on. And up until the early 2000s, late 90s, we believed in something called genetic determinism, which is a linear thought that our genes determine everything about our health and who we will be and how our bodies will respond. That's pretty recently that we had this idea that we were basically at the mercy of our genetics. So it was actually hugely heretical to the scientific community when they started to realize that epigenetics was a thing, that our actual environment and lived experience could change the expression in our genes. So the first experiment happened where epigenetics was discovered happened at Emory University when researchers taught male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossoms by associating the scent with mild foot shocks. I do want to say for 1 second that I'd like to acknowledge I don't know how I feel about what we do to animals to learn these things. We learn so much from them, but I also feel very weird about it. And I just want to acknowledge that, even though I'm bringing this research forward. So they taught the male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossoms. 2 weeks later, they bred them with females, and the resulting pups were raised to adulthood without ever encountering the smell of cherry blossom. And the first time those pups smelled cherry blossom, they became very anxious and fearful. And their noses and brain space had more neurons devoted to being able to pick up the smell of cherry blossom. And so this is the first case of epigenetic evidence. And what this tells us is that the memory transmission of our parents and grandparents extend into our biophysiology, without a genetic change or mutation. It changes the way our genes express themselves. And I know this is something probably everyone here has already heard, but I wanted to bring it up because I think it's not access to information that is missing. It is feeling the consequence and metabolizing the consequence of this information that I sometimes find missing. And to think that something that scared my great great grandparent may be impacting something I am internalizing about a neurotic fear that I have really paves a way for me to love myself and to seek to understand myself and have a deep sense of compassion for this kind of cellular memory that my body has the sacred privilege of having access to, while at the same time giving myself a second to not judge myself when I experience this, let's call it irrational fear that will sometimes come up. It really makes me curious about my ancestors. It really makes me curious about my own experience. It's almost like I'm a walking time machine of people, like multiple people live within me and around me because of the ability of their experiences to change the way my genes express. And to sort of explain the mechanism of why this happens, because I think it's pretty cool, we have 50 trillion cells, and every single cell in our body has 6 linear feet of DNA, which is insane. Bobby is wild. So I think about this as the downstairs stacks at the library, because the way we're able to fit all this DNA in a cell is we wrap it and coil it like a spool of thread. And when we're talking about different things in our environment, changing our genetic expression without changing our actual DNA, what we're talking about is the environment around us showing us which stack of books is going to be available and which stack of books is going to be silenced or unavailable. I also want to take a moment to think about the profound fact that in every single cell in us, all the information of the rest of us is there. You can learn about my bones from taking my hair. That's incredibly profound. And I think it kind of speaks to the fractal nature of the universe, that wherever you go, the whole is there, that every one of us is like a little universe within ourselves. Like every one of us is like a solar system. And like we were saying last module, there's all these microbes that interact with our genes that we don't even know yet what they are or how they communicate with us, which makes us kind of like walking miracle, like this is incredible. And yet we've been taught to always focus on what we're doing wrong and how we're not enough, which is, I think, just like the biggest scam of our time. Like, what? We're incredible. Like, we're incredible. We don't even really fully know where we come from or what we are. We should be way more interested in focusing on this, in my opinion. But in any case, I think that epigenetics is so beautiful because just like the nervous system and co-regulation training, it's showing us that we are more potential than we are set in stone, and that there is a lot of creative ability to shift our DNA. We can make decisions that change the way our DNA expresses itself, which is amazing. And so I want to talk about the work of someone named Dr. Skinner. Dr. Michael Skinner is a biologist who established the Washington State University and University of Idaho Center of Reproductive Biology. And one of the things that he noticed is that you can find very high rates of disease in certain regions. And he started looking at the populations of the people where disease was really high and looking at their DNA. What he found was that the genetic mutation that we're told causes disease, right? Genetic mutation only was present in 1% of the people who had that disease in these high frequency disease population. So he said to himself, clearly this is not a genetic basis because these numbers are impossible. Their genes aren't showing this disease. So why is this disease turning on in them? And so he said to himself, it must be their environment. because 99% of the people he studied did not experience the genetic mutation of those disease. So he went around to explain that if you're a 5-year-old and you have a genetic makeup and you move to a place that has a high frequency of disease, you're more likely to line up with the place you're living in terms of the percentage chance that you will get those diseases than you are to be determined by your birth genetics. And so he goes on to say that in all major diseases, we've seen a dramatic increase as much as tenfold in the last 20 to 30 years. And based on his understanding of the human genome, this mathematically cannot be genetic. So, what is causing it? Well, what he studied, first of all, was the way environment impacts us as beings. And he noticed that if a mother is exposed to toxic environments, which includes plastics, heat, industrial chemicals, pesticide, fungicide, jet fuel, etc., that the level of transgenerational disease for the next 3 to 4 generations at least goes up 90%. Now, this includes the toxicity could also come from stress. And by the way, this doesn't just happen in animals and humans, it happens in plants who experience histories of drought and famine in their genome. And they now have the technology to look at the specific genetic imprint of a being, and they can understand what the toxin probably was that was experienced 4 generations ago just by looking at the fingerprint. Now, I feel like this sounds scary, but I don't think it is. I think it's what it is making an extreme case for it to be a right of the people and the planet for them to stop poisoning it, not by looking at something culturally specific, which is somehow the way we talk about these things. It becomes about political party XYZ, but something just so simple as paying attention to the health of human beings and the way we value and treat people who bear children in this country and in many countries. And I think that it is just good sense, whether or not you're just being an economically self-interested person or you're using your sense of compassion and interconnection to think about child rearing, being a child, taking care of a child, and being a parent as one of the most sacred times and roles of existence. And we were all children, right? Everyone, was there something I don't know? And I think that it's really sad that we run ourselves over. I spent the better of most of my early adulthood trying to figure out what's wrong with me. And I think part of the reason I'm bringing all this forward is to share that our response to the world we live in is very sane. It's very rational to be overwhelmed at times. It's very rational to be confused at times. And it's very, very evolutionary intelligent to want to create connections, either creatively with other people or with yourself. What I see as a lifestyle and a culture where we don't actually have time to do that, and that's put on us as our failure. When to me, it seems designed to make these things way harder than they need to be. And so I just want to encourage a relationship with your being and all the memories of all the people and experiences that have been had by not just your ancestry, but by you. And also share with you an extremely private thing. And it's a part of my cosmology. I talk to my DNA. I talk to my DNA every day and the water in my body. That's part of my experiment. And we're going to get to all of us designing our own experiments from these different exercises we've been doing. And I ask it, I tell it certain things don't need to be there anymore. And that if there are certain abilities and ways that things I hold within me that can help me create clarity in myself and authenticity in myself, I call that forward. And considering that we're mostly made of water and that water can contain imprints and that we don't know what consciousness is, I'm just open to the possibilities of this experiment that I've been doing with myself for some time. I also want to point out something really amazing, which is that in this realm of epigenetics, there was a scientist named Randy Jerdal, who was a professor of radiation and oncology at Duke, studying the agouti gene in agouti mice. So, agouti mice are mice that are born very obese and they are yellow in color. And oftentimes they're prone to a lot of pretty gnarly diseases and don't live very long. And because of all the epigenetic studies that were coming out, this doctor decided to feed the mothers, the agouti mothers who have the agouti gene, kale, which has something called a methyl group within the kale. What he found was that in just one generation, the pups that were born did not have the agouti gene. They actually lived much longer, healthier lives. Just because of one change in the environment, the genetic expression changed for those pups. So I know it feels very heavy sometimes to hear these things, but sometimes the changes that are needed might be a lot simpler and easier than we think. In fact, you can have genes that promote a very, very intense form cardiac problems and obesity. And by simply taking a walk every day for 30 minutes, you can minimize the expression of that gene by 40 to 50% by just that one choice. So I want to say agency and history both live in us. They dance with each other. You know, those are kind of like our creative materials of who we are, of our beingness. Something really interesting is that they found that rats have a gene called a glucocorticoid receptor. We'll call it GCR. And when this gene is expressed, it makes a rat very, very able to cope with stress. And what they found was that it is this gene is not yet able to be received or be accessed by the genome. What unlocks this ability, this resilience to stressful situations, is a mother's grooming and a mother's touch and a mother's love. So that changes gene expression as well. So I just wanted to share that. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of emerging fields I've been really interested in. I'm pretty excited to talk to you all. There's a doctor that I came across when he was doing a pain conference with the Open Center in New York City. His name is Dr. David Hanscom. And he was an orthopedic complex spinal deformity surgeon for 32 years and suffered from chronic pain for 15 years. Now, he has mostly stopped doing risky surgeries because he has found that there are a lot of different ways that we can handle pain outside of the mechanistic and chemical model that most of modern medicine, Western medicine, is based in. And one thing he said struck me so much. First of all, he always talks about how the pain circuitry in the body that is physical and the mental pain circuitry in the body are the same neurologically. They're exactly the same. So when you're in pain, it can create mental pain, and then that can exacerbate that and create more physical pain. And this can become kind of a biofeedback loop. So what he talks about is working with this neurocircuitry very creatively. One of the things he said was that there's a direct correlation with how much time you spend with your caretaker and the chances that you will receive a positive effect of treatment. Because when you are establishing a sense of trust with your caretaker, your nervous system is more likely to be open to learning something new, including learning pathways outside that pain circuitry pathway. And so he talks about how, as a surgeon, he was never allowed to see people for more than a certain amount of time because of the economic model in our medical system, which obviously has a for profit aspect to it. And so he has this new, pretty low cost offering called Direct Your Own Care Journey, where he teaches people how to create new pathways for their chronic pain using neuroplasticity and relational tools and awakening their pleasure and play centers. He says, as a scientist, that to him every symptom, pleasant or unpleasant, is created by your body's response to your surroundings, and that the cues of safety create contentment and well-being, and that threats cause the opposite effect, which elevate our stress, increase metabolism, and inflammation. To him, structural abnormalities are a factor only a small percent of the time, and that sustained and prolonged threats, which can include your own thoughts and emotions, can often cause the pain that then becomes illness. So I wanted to share his work with you, and it's going to be in your resource list. I don't suffer from the type of chronic pain that some other people do, so I can't comfortably say that this methodology will work for everyone, but I think it's really beautiful that he works with connectivity and neuroplasticity as a low cost model for people to work with their pain. The other work I'm really excited to talk to you about is from Eileen McCusick, and I've already talked to you about her. So Eileen McCusick is a sound healer who went back to school as an adult to get a master's on the electric body. This is why I was saying before that I think it's so interesting that our nervous system communicates to us in electricity. So she was doing sound as a hobby for a long time. And then she started finding certain things in the field, like she could start to hear different sounds and know what that sound was telling her about the state of a person's organ. And over time, she started to develop patterns that showed her whether something was from the maternal side, the paternal side, based on where the sound was made, where the tuning fork was and the sound it was making, how long ago it happened. And what she explains in her worldview is that everything in our body has a frequency, meaning everything jitters or jangles or has a hum to it. And that we can either be in a state of coherence, and that's when everything is a state of talking with itself, right? And there's a coherence, or we can be in a state of dissonance. And what she discovered is that sound not only has the ability to tune our system or our electric body, that our body then tells the sound what's going on. And then the sound retunes the body. And then the body gives a new sound. And this feedback loop happens where you can hear the sounds change as she drags the sound forks, the tuning forks around a person's body and tells you what they may mean. And so I really wanted to introduce this because while we're talking about all this heavy stuff, this is a very simple, elegant, and if you're very, very into science, like hardcore science, a very, very scientifically backed methodology to address how we can create coherence in our bodies. She describes our bodies almost like this symphony that just needs the right tuning fork to attune itself to. And one thing I love about this is, we can do this for ourselves. And there are also tones you can create with your own body through humming and sound that allow you to do this for yourself. So I wanted to bring that forward. And the last thing I wanted to say and introduce people to is the discovery that we originally thought that the communication with the heart and the brain went one way, that the brain only told the heart what to do. But there are many studies that explain that there is definitely a two-way communication between the brain and the heart, and that the heart has its own neurons that are sometimes referred to as the heart's brain, and that the heart also has demonstrated its own sense of logic that diverged from the direction that the nervous system wants to go in. And that there is evidence that the heart appears to send messages to the brain that it understands and sometimes obeys. So when we drop into our hearts, into our meditation in the beginning, the reason I do that is so that we have access to the resources, not just of the neurons in our minds, but also the neurons in the heart that are our heart's brain, our heart's mind. And this is something that's active in polyvagal theory, but I'm going to send you information where you can read about this if you're interested in it. But how I like to play with it is just really actually focusing and dropping all of my focus and awareness into my heart space and to see if I get different information than the information I get when I'm focused on my intellect. And I just do a practice of that probably every day, several times a day, to see if there's more coherence there.